Good afternoon. Jasper Masters from CBRE. My question is really directed, I suppose, at Vince Cable in the first instance, but in the event of a potential hung parliament, I assume that the Lib Dems could hold some sway over aspects of town planning policy. Are the Lib Dems more closely aligned to the top-down planning approach under Labour or the bottom-up localised approach outlined in the recent Conservative Green Paper?
Dr. Cable.
Well, I'm not going to go into all the scenarios around hung parliaments, but I will tell you about our broad approach to planning, which is the exact opposite of what you describe. The approach is very much a bottom-up rather than a top-down approach. We believe in local government. We practice it. Our people actually run 7 of the 10 biggest cities in Britain. And we worry about the over-centralisation of government. We do want a bottom-up approach. We don't agree with the Labour government's planning reforms and the Planning Commission, and we think there should be a bigger democratic content. And we would like to have a stronger appeal system for third parties. And as a local MP, I'm very conscious of the way in which the planning system often overrides very legitimate local objections. So I suspect simply in the narrow context of your question, I'm probably closer to John Gummer here than I am to the Labour Party.
John, do you recognise those views that you sympathise?
Well, yes, I think in many of those ways. I mean, I'm deeply opposed to third-party appeals. I think that would be a disaster. As a matter of fact, I do disagree with Vince on that, and even the very limited proposals that we've made I don't agree with. And the reason is this, that I think we ought to remember what planning is. It's an imposition on the owner of the property. It's a necessary imposition, it's a necessary part of it, but if you believe in property ownership, then you really must accept that the person who owns the property has the right to appeal where that is accorded, but it's a different right from a third party, because a third party is represented, or ought to be represented, by proper local democracy. So where Vince and I come together is that we need to have much more power for the locality to make decisions. I object to those comments in the House of Commons by the Labour Party, attacking both the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, by saying that if local people had their say, then nothing would happen. It would just stop. Well, frankly, if that's the attitude, then we will never have democracy in this country. It will always be something that is dictated by people who know better than ourselves. My own view is that if you make the locality have the benefit of development, which they don't have at the moment, and we don't need to go into a long history about why that is, and the idea is that the locality that agrees to a development would keep over and above anything else, would keep the business rate and the local council tax for that development for a period of 6 years, which I hope will go to 10, then at least people have a balance. And I suspect that in these tough times, people will be willing to try to get development where that's right, but at the same time they'll stand up when development is wrong, and that balance is a local balance and ought to be local.
Simon Milton, do you detect any major differences between the parties on planning?
Well, I think you've heard that there are very significant differences, and it really boils down to whether you should have a system which is rebalanced towards a greater local determination, or continue with the top-down system where everything flows from national policy statements and then everybody else has to, in a sense, comply upwards. So there is a very significant difference, but and I think the recent Conservative Planning Green Paper is very radical and sets out some important principles. Firstly, this rebalancing towards localism, which I support. Secondly, the presumption in favour of sustainable development, which again I support. There is a lot of detail that needs to be ironed out under those principles, and I agree with John Gummer that there is a hell of a lot of detail that needs to be gone through on issues like third-party appeals, if they are not to detract from that other key principle I mentioned, which is the presumption in favour of sustainable development.
Tristram Hunt.
I think there are differences in the party. If I was a developer, I'd want to get building pretty quickly before May the 6th or May the 7th. I think a lot of things are going to be begin to be held up quite quite seriously. I mean, I think these things go in waves, and there's a John Gower was part of the administration which withdrew business rates from local authority, and now we want to give them back. And there's a battle within the Tory party, I think, between the sort of the localisers and the decentralisers and the sort of progressives and those more orientated around the Treasury team who just want to, make sure the economy gets moving again, and how that pans itself out will be rather interesting. I think my suspicion is that the localisers will probably move out, because we hear not enough from George Osborne and Philip Hampton on these kind of important questions.
Vince, everyone in this hall wants the planning process streamlined, brought somehow into the modern world. Things can happen quicker, the cherished projects can go ahead, but how can that be made to happen without the possibility of the most awful mistakes which cannot be rectified being made?
Well, you've set out the dilemma in your question. I mean, what frustrates developers, which I do have some sympathy, is with when planning applications take an enormously long time because of very prolonged and highly legalistic inquiries. I was opposed to the expansion of Heathrow for a mixture of local and general environmental considerations, but there's no justification having 10 years of procrastination. So I think that is the issue. It's about making decisions clearly and decisively, but making the right ones. And you have to have checks and balances. And there has to be, as John said earlier, local opinion has to be properly integrated within the planning system.
But if the weight of local opinion is not in my backyard, I think we'd never get done. Yeah?
Well, I'm not sure that's true. I think if you get the proper balance so that people do get some real benefit from agreeing to growth, then that will happen, and it's why I want to change it. I agree with them. So I think there are some very simple things that could be done. For example, I do not understand why in big planning decisions we have to wait for 3 years while somebody writes an enormous document about it. It seems to me that we ought to have a system whereby the inspector, having heard the whole thing, actually makes an announcement and says, this is what I have decided. There may be 3 particular points I want to draw attention to, but that is it. And I remember that was the suggestion, actually, on the Heathrow proposal. It was suggested by the man who was made the inspector. But I was the Secretary of State at the time, and I never heard about that suggestion. And it turned out that he had suggestions to my senior civil servants who didn't tell me because they knew I would say yes. And so there is a problem here which has to be overcome. And the second thing, which is very easy, I think, is that you need to have the inspector being able, as he is to some extent, but not sufficiently, to say, frankly, if you're going to come and tell me the same thing under different hats, I am going to say that that particular issue has now been covered. You really can't come back as the green operation, the National Association of this, that and the others. There is a reasonable amount of statement. Now that can shorten it, and there are ways of shortening the situation. The other thing is, we've really got to have a position in which we do the work on the plan, and if your proposal is in accordance with the local plan, then there really is automatic agreement. Yes, details about the design and the other things, but you do not have a situation of hanging about when people actually argue about something that has already been decided because the plan has already been decided. So there are ways of improving the system, but you cannot in the end have a system which is both democratic and very fast. The only country that does it is the French, and they have learned that bribery is the third possibility.